"You need a home, and I need a mommy," said the little girl to the mail-order bride left. The train's whistle dies like a prayer in the wasteland. Margaret stands on the platform of Copper Falls, her white dress a mockery against the rust-stained earth. Behind her, the iron beast hisses and retreats, carrying away her last connection to hope. In her hand, a crumpled note. "Changed my mind. Find your own way." She is a ghost at her own funeral. The town watches through dirty windows another broken promise delivered to their doorstep. Another woman discarded like yesterday's newspaper. The sun bleeds crimson across the horizon, painting the world in shades of abandonment. But as darkness falls like a curtain on her dreams, a small voice cuts through the silence, thin as a knife, sharp as survival. "You look lost, lady." Margaret turns. A child emerges from the shadows of the depot, small and fierce as a desert wildflower growing through cracked stone. 7 years old, maybe 8, with hair like tangled wheat and eyes that have seen too much of the world's cruelty. "So do you," Margaret whispers, and in that moment, two broken souls recognize their reflection in each other's eyes. The beginning of something impossible. The birth of a family forged not in blood, but in the desperate alchemy of survival and hope. What happens when two abandoned souls find each other in the wasteland? Share your thoughts below. Have you ever found family where you least expected it? The heat rose from the platform like prayers from hell. Margaret Whitmore stood alone, her wedding dress a flag of surrender in the punishing sun of Copper Falls. The fabric bore the dust of 1,000 miles, and the salt stains of tears she refused to shed. Her valise sat beside her feet like a faithful dog, the only witness to her complete and utter ruin. "Mrs. Brennan," the station master's voice cut through her stupor, rough as sandpaper on raw wood. "I mean, Miss—" She turned. His face was a road map of pity, creased with the kind of sympathy that came cheap and left quickly. In his weathered hands he held an envelope thin as her hopes, yellow as old bones. "This came for you on the morning wire." The paper crackled between her fingers. Thomas Brennan's handwriting, once so careful in his courtship letters, now scrawled with the urgency of a man fleeing his own promises. "Changed my mind about marriage. Town ain't suitable for a lady. Find your own way back east. TB, 18 months of correspondence. A journey of 2,000 miles. A life savings spent on train fare and hope. Reduced to 3 sentences and a signature that looked like a man's dying breath. He left money for your return passage." The station master said, his voice gentler now. "It's not much, but it'll get you to Denver." Margaret looked at the bills he offered. $23. The price of her dignity, apparently. The cost of being unmade by a coward's change of heart. "Keep it," she said, her voice steady as granite. "I won't be needing it." The depot cast a long shadow in the dying light. As she reached its edge, movement flickered in her peripheral vision. A child stepped from the darkness between two abandoned freight cars, a girl thin as a rail and twice as tough, with matted blonde hair and a dress that had seen better decades. "You, the mail-order bride?" the child asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone far older than her 7 or 8 years. Margaret hesitated. "I was supposed to be. But he didn't want you." It wasn't a question. The child stated it with the matter-of-fact cruelty that only children possess the ability to speak truth like a knife between the ribs. "No," Margaret said. "He didn't." The girl nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already known about the world. Men are like that. Promise you everything, then leave you with nothing. She studied Margaret with eyes that belonged in an older face. "You got anywhere to go?" "No." "Me neither." They stood in the growing darkness, two souls balanced on the knife's edge of nowhere. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain that would never come. "I'm Lucy," the child said. "Lucy Harper. Used to be anyway. Now I'm just Lucy nothing at all. Margaret, she replied. Margaret, I suppose I'm nothing at all too now. Lucy smiled a quick, fierce expression that transformed her entire face. Well, then, Margaret nothing at all, seems like we got something in common. Standing in the shadow of an abandoned depot, while the world grew dark around them, Margaret felt the first stirring of something she'd thought was dead forever. Hope. But it was a dangerous kind of hope. The kind that could kill you if you held it too tightly. The kind that could save you if you were brave enough to let it grow. The palace was a lie, built from necessity and dreams. Lucy led Margaret through the town's dying arteries, past the general store with its broken windows, past houses where honest folk slept, in honest beds with honest futures. They walked until the town's last gasping breath gave way to open prairie where the darkness was honest and the stars told no lies. There, Lucy said, pointing to a shape against the horizon. Margaret squinted. At first she saw only shadow and ruin. Then the moonlight shifted, and she understood. It was a homestead, or had been once. The main structure still stood, though its roof bore holes like bullet wounds, and its walls leaned inward like a man dying on his feet. Home sweet home, Lucy said, but there was no bitterness in her voice, only a fierce protective pride that made Margaret's chest tighten. Inside, Lucy had created a civilization from scraps. A mattress made of prairie grass and old blankets, a circle of stones for a fire pit, shelves carved into the remaining walls holding treasures that meant everything and nothing, a dented tin cup, a book with half its pages burned away, a wooden doll with one button eye hanging by a thread. It ain't much, Lucy said, suddenly shy, but it keeps the wind off, mostly. Margaret set down her valise and looked around, really looked. She saw the careful way Lucy had arranged stones to channel rainwater, the ingenious system of ropes and pulleys that could close a canvas tarp over the largest hole in the roof. The subtle but unmistakable signs of someone who had learned to wring life from the most barren circumstances. It's remarkable, Margaret said and meant it. Lucy's face lit up like sunrise. Really, really, you've built something here. Something real. They sat by the fire pit as Lucy coaxed flames from tinder, her small hands sure and practiced. In the growing light, Margaret could see the child more clearly, the hollows under her eyes that spoke of too many hungry nights, the careful way she moved that suggested someone accustomed to making herself invisible. How long have you been alone? Margaret asked. 6 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. Lucy didn't look up from the fire. Prairie fire took Mama and Papa. Happened fast. 1 minute we were eating supper, next minute the whole world was burning. She poked at the flames with a charred stick. I ran. They didn't. The words fell between them like stones into deep water, creating ripples that spread outward in ever-widening circles of understanding. Margaret had lost a future. Lucy had lost a past. Both had been abandoned by the very forces they'd trusted to protect them. They shared a supper of hardtack and preserved meat, washing it down with water that tasted of tin and hope. Margaret told Lucy about Boston, about her life as a governess, about the loneliness that had driven her to answer Thomas Brennan's advertisement. Lucy spoke of her parents, her father's gentleness, her mother's fierce love. You need a home, Lucy said softly, and I need a mommy. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, not painful, but transformative. The simple, terrible truth of it. The naked honesty of a child who had nothing left to lose and everything to hope for. Yes, Margaret whispered. Yes, what? Yes, I think I'll stay. If you'll have me. Lucy's smile was the sun coming up after the longest night of winter. Dawn came like a promise the world wasn't sure it could keep. Margaret woke to the smell of wood smoke and something green and growing that seemed impossible in this landscape of sage and stone. Lucy was already up tending a fire and humming a tune that sounded like water over rocks. Morning, Mama Margaret, Lucy said, not looking up from the flames. The words hit Margaret's chest like warm honey sweet and shocking. She'd been called Miss Whitmore for 32 years, ma'am, by the polite nothing-at-all, by most of the world. But Mama Margaret, that was a name worth answering to. Morning, sweetheart. The first weeks were a lesson in the grammar of survival. Lucy knew things Margaret had never dreamed of, which plants could be eaten, where to find water in a landscape that seemed bone dry. Margaret brought her own treasures, the ability to read and write knowledge of medicine gleaned from years of caring for her employer's children, a stubborn refinement that refused to be broken by circumstance. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their hands learning the language of hammer and nail needle, and thread hope and sweat. Margaret's silk dress gave way to practical cotton. Her soft hands grew calloused. Her refined posture adapted to the demands of lifting, carrying, building. "You're getting strong," Lucy observed one afternoon, watching Margaret split kindling. "You're getting smarter," Margaret replied, nodding toward the letters Lucy was scratching in the dirt. They were teaching each other the alphabet of becoming. The townspeople took notice. Mrs. Hartwell from the general store was the first to approach, arriving one scorching afternoon with a basket of day-old bread and a curiosity sharp as her tongue. "Heard you two were making a go of it out here," she said, her eyes taking inventory of their improvements. They'd patched the roof, reinforced the walls, built a proper door from salvaged planks. "We're managing," Margaret said carefully. Mrs. Hartwell studied Lucy, who was practicing her letters in the shade of the repaired porch. "Child needs schooling." "She's getting it," Margaret replied, steel creeping into her voice. "From you, what makes you qualified?" "I was a governess in Boston for 12 years. I taught children of some of the finest families in New England." Margaret's spine straightened. "Lucy is receiving an excellent education." Mrs. Hartwell blinked, clearly, recalibrating her assumptions. "My youngest has been struggling with his reading. His teacher back east said some children need special attention." Margaret felt the first stirring of possibility. "I might be able to help." It was the first crack in the wall between their little homestead and the wider world. Over the following weeks, other parents came. Margaret's reputation grew, so did their modest income. More importantly, their place in the community began to shift from curiosity to necessity. "We're really doing it," Lucy said one evening as they sat on their repaired porch watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. "We're making it work." Margaret reached over and took the child's hand, work-roughened, now strong and capable. "Yes," she said, "we are." But even as she spoke the words, she felt the shadow of unfinished business creeping across their happiness like clouds before a storm. Truth was a weapon Margaret had never learned to wield. But standing on her porch with Lucy's small hand clasped in hers, she felt the weight of it sharp and clean and absolutely unforgiving. The sound of approaching hoofbeats carried across the evening air 3 riders coming fast from town, their purpose written in the urgent rhythm of their horses' gait. Margaret recognized Sheriff Coleman, a decent man, trapped in an indecent situation. Beside him rode Dr. Thorne from town. And the third man. Margaret's blood turned to ice water. Thomas Brennan sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain, his eyes taking in their improvements with the satisfied air of a man inventorying his possessions. He'd grown thinner since their correspondence ended, his face bearing the gaunt look of a man who'd been living hard and sleeping poorly. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying all the warmth of winter wind, "you look settled. Mr. Brennan here says you're his wife." Sheriff Coleman said, his discomfort evident. "Says you ran off after a domestic dispute and he's come to bring you home." The lie hit her like a physical blow. "We were never married. He abandoned me at the train station." Thomas smiled, the same charming expression that had won her heart through 18 months of letters. "Now, darling, you know that's not how it happened. You got scared, talked yourself into believing I didn't want you." "I am not hysterical," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. "And Lucy is not an attachment. She's my daughter. Legally speaking, Thomas said, his tone reasonable as poison, the child belongs to the territory. As her nearest male relative, I've petitioned to become her guardian. The papers went through yesterday. Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. You're not related to her. Distant cousin on her father's side. Amazing what comes to light when you know how to look for it. No. The word came from behind Margaret, high and clear and fierce as a battle cry. Lucy stood in the doorway, no longer the frightened child, but a small warrior defending her ground. This is our home. You can't make us leave. Thomas looked at the child with the same expression he might wear while examining a horse he was considering purchasing. Lucy, isn't it you're going to come live with Margaret and me? I already have everything, Lucy said. I have Mama Margaret. Margaret felt something ignite in her chest, a fire she didn't know she possessed, a strength borrowed from the child who taught her the meaning of home. You want to take her, Margaret said, her voice carrying across the evening air like the crack of a whip. Then you'll have to go through me first. Thomas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. And what exactly are you going to do to stop me? Margaret smiled, and it was a dangerous expression. I'm going to tell the truth. She spoke of Thomas's gambling debts, his forged mining claims, his pattern of defrauding mail-order brides. Each revelation struck Thomas like a physical blow, his facade crumbling. Your claim to be Lucy's cousin is fraudulent, Margaret continued. I've traced her family genealogy quite thoroughly. The Harper family has no living male relatives. Sheriff Coleman dismounted, his hand resting on his gun belt. Is that true, Brennan? Thomas's eyes darted between them, calculating his odds. This isn't over, he said finally. You've made an enemy today. Neither am I, Margaret replied. Which is why I've already sent detailed reports of your activities to the Territorial Marshal's office. Thomas mounted his horse with jerky movements and disappeared into the darkness like the coward he'd always been. But Margaret knew this was only the beginning. Winter came early and stayed late like an unwelcome guest who'd forgotten their manners. By November, the wind carried ice crystals that cut exposed skin like tiny razors, and snow fell in sheets that seemed to pour from the very bones of the sky. The world became a study in white and gray, all harsh edges and unforgiving geometry. Margaret and Lucy had prepared as best they could, stored food in root cellars dug deep into the earth's frozen belly, reinforced their home against the relentless assault of prairie storms, laid in enough firewood to last until spring's distant promise. But they hadn't prepared for what winter brought with it, riding the bitter wind like a plague. Mrs. Hartwell arrived on a Tuesday morning when the air was so cold it seemed to crack with each breath, her usual composed demeanor fractured by obvious distress. Her face bore the grayish pallor of someone who hadn't slept, and her hand shook as she accepted the cup of coffee Margaret offered, not from cold, but from something deeper and more terrible. It's the children, she said without preamble, her voice a harsh whisper. 3 of them down with fever. Started with the Morrison boy 2 days ago, spread to his sister by yesterday morning, and now the preacher's youngest is burning up something fierce. Margaret felt ice form in her veins that had nothing to do with the weather outside. In her years as a governess, she'd seen how quickly childhood illnesses could spread through a community, how swiftly they could transform from concern to catastrophe. Dr. Thorne, gone, left town 2 weeks ago on the morning stage. Mrs. Hartwell's voice carried the bitter weight of abandonment. Said he was visiting family back east for the holidays, but she let the implications hang in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Dr. Thorne had been present for Thomas Brennan's humiliation, had witnessed Margaret's devastating revelation of the man's crimes. His sudden departure suggested either cowardice or complicity, neither option offering much comfort to parents watching their children burn with fever. What are the symptoms? Margaret asked her governess, training automatically engaging. 12 years of caring for other people's children had taught her to recognize the early signs of serious illness, to read the subtle language of childhood distress. High fever that won't break, difficulty breathing, spots appearing on the chest and arms. Mrs. Hartwell's face was carved with lines of exhaustion and fear. The Morrison boy. He's not conscious anymore. Just lies there like a broken doll, breathing so shallow you have to put your ear to his chest to know he's still alive. Margaret closed her eyes, running through everything she'd learned about childhood diseases during her years in Boston. The symptoms Mrs. Hartwell described could be several things: scarlet fever perhaps, or measles, or something worse. Without proper medical knowledge, without Dr. Thorne's expertise, the children faced a battle they might not survive. "I need to see them," she said, already reaching for her heavy coat. "Margaret, no." Lucy appeared in the doorway like a fierce guardian spirit, her young face pale with understanding and terror. "It's too dangerous. You could catch it too, and then what would happen to us? Sweetheart, don't you sweetheart me." Lucy interrupted, her voice carrying a determination that would have been amusing under other circumstances. "I already lost one mama to forces I couldn't control. I won't lose another." Margaret knelt before the child, taking Lucy's small hands in both of hers. The gesture was gentle, but her voice carried steel beneath the softness. "Lucy, those children need help. Their parents are terrified, and there's no one else who might know what to do. I can't just sit here while they suffer." "Then I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not." "Then you're not going either." Lucy's jaw set with the kind of mulish stubbornness that Margaret had come to recognize as the child's deepest strength. "We're family. We stick together. That's what families do." Mrs. Hartwell watched this exchange with something approaching wonder, seeing perhaps for the first time the true depth of the bond between the abandoned bride and the orphaned child. "The little one's got a point, Margaret. You've been teaching half the town's children these past months. They know you trust you. And in times like this, trust might be more powerful than medical knowledge." For the next 3 days, Margaret fought a battle against disease and despair that tested every fiber of her being. She moved from house to house like a ministering angel, Lucy at her side, despite all protests, carrying willow bark tea and fever-reducing poultices made from herbs she'd learned about from frontier women. The work was exhausting, heartbreaking, and often seemed futile, but she persisted with the grim determination of someone who understood that sometimes the act of caring itself was a form of medicine. She sat vigil with terrified parents, teaching them to recognize the signs of crisis, sharing what little medical knowledge she possessed, gleaned from years of practical experience. She held burning children while their mothers wept, spooning cool water between cracked lips and singing lullabies in a voice made hoarse from exhaustion. Lucy proved invaluable, her small size allowing her to slip between sickbeds, her natural empathy providing comfort in ways that adult presence sometimes couldn't. The Morrison boy died on the second night, slipping away so quietly that his mother didn't realize he was gone until Margaret gently closed his still eyes. His sister followed 12 hours later, her small body finally surrendering to the fever that had ravaged her for days. Margaret held Mrs. Morrison as the woman collapsed with grief, feeling her own heart break a little more with each keening sob. But the preacher's daughter lived, and slowly, one by one, the other children began to recover. The fever broke in the banker's son on the 3rd morning. The teacher's twin girls opened their eyes and asked for water. Small victories, but victories nonetheless, proof that sometimes love and determination could triumph where medicine failed. When the crisis finally passed, Margaret found herself fundamentally changed in the eyes of the community. She was no longer the strange woman playing house with an orphan child. She was the teacher who'd stayed when the doctor fled, the healer who'd held their children's lives in her hands and refused to let go. The transformation was subtle, but profound. A shift in how people looked at her, spoke to her, included her in the fabric of their lives. "You saved them," Mrs. Hartwell said as they stood in the cemetery watching the Morrison children being laid to rest in the frozen ground. Not all of them, Margaret replied, her voice thick with grief for the lives that couldn't be preserved. You saved the ones you could. That's what matters. That's what makes the difference between existing and living. Lucy slipped her small hand into Margaret's, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. Papa used to say that courage ain't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are scared, even when you don't know if you'll succeed. Margaret squeezed the small fingers, drawing strength from the child's wisdom. Your papa was a wise man, sweetheart. He would be proud of you, of both of us. As spring began to stir beneath winter's dying grip, Margaret felt something new taking root in her heart. Not just hope, but certainty. This was where she belonged, not in some distant city playing at respectability, but here in this harsh, honest place where love was measured not in grand gestures, but in small acts of daily devotion. But spring brought more than just the promise of renewal. It brought a letter that would test everything they'd built. The letter arrived on a Tuesday that smelled of new grass and infinite possibility. Margaret turned the envelope over in her hands, recognizing immediately the elegant script of her sister Catherine back in Boston. The paper was expensive, cream-colored and thick, carrying with it the weight of old money and older expectations. Inside words that might have once seemed like salvation, written in Catherine's careful hand. Dearest Margaret, we've learned of your circumstances through mutual acquaintances who've been most concerned for your welfare. Father has reconsidered his position and agreed to welcome you home with full forgiveness. The Cavendish family, you remember them, surely their governess departed rather suddenly under mysterious circumstances. A position awaits you there with excellent references and a salary that would allow you to rebuild your life properly. You could leave that dreadful place and return to civilization, to family, to the respectability that is your birthright. The words seemed to float on the page, disconnected from the reality of her current life. Margaret read them twice, then a third time, feeling as though she were looking at artifacts from a previous existence, one that belonged to someone else entirely. Lucy read over her shoulder, her small face carefully blank, in the way Margaret had learned meant the child was experiencing emotions too large for her young heart to contain. That's good news, ain't it? You could go home, back to your real family. The phrase hit Margaret like a physical blow. Real family. As if the bond forged between them in fire and hardship, the love built stone by stone from the rubble of their separate tragedies, was somehow less authentic than the accident of shared blood. Margaret looked at the child, really looked at her, seeing not just who Lucy was now, but who she was becoming. The frightened waif who'd emerged from the depot shadows was gone, replaced by a confident girl with bright, intelligent eyes and capable hands that could tend a garden, help sick children, and comfort grieving mothers. Lucy had grown taller, stronger, more beautiful with each passing day, her natural resilience blooming under Margaret's careful nurturing. She deserved silk dresses and proper school's piano lessons and finishing academies. She deserved the kind of future that only money and social position could provide, the kind that Margaret's Boston connections might make possible. It would mean leaving you behind, Margaret said quietly, testing the words like a woman probing a wound to assess its depth. Maybe that's for the best. Lucy's voice was steady, but Margaret caught the tremor beneath the surface, the carefully controlled fear of another abandonment. Maybe you should go back to your real family. I've been taking care of myself for a long time. I can keep doing it. The words were brave, but they carried the hollow ring of a child trying to convince herself as much as the adult she was addressing. Margaret saw through the pretense to the terror beneath Lucy's desperate attempt to release the person she loved most, rather than risk another devastating loss. Lucy Harper, Margaret said, kneeling before the child and taking her face gently between her hands. Look at me. Reluctantly, Lucy raised her eyes, and Margaret saw in them all the accumulated sorrow of a short life, marked by too much loss, too much uncertainty. But she also saw love fierce, protective, and absolutely genuine. "Do you know what makes a family?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but unwavering. Lucy shook her head, not trusting her voice. "It's not blood. It's not law. It's not what other people say or think about us." Margaret's thumbs brushed away the tears that had begun to slide down Lucy's cheeks. "It's choice. Every morning when we wake up, we choose to care for each other. We choose to stay when things get hard. We choose to fight for what we've built together. And every single day since that first night in the depot, I've made the same choice." "What choice?" Lucy whispered. "I choose you. Every day, every hour, every heartbeat. You are my daughter, Lucy Harper. Not because some piece of paper says so, not because society approves, but because my heart says so. Because when I look at you, I see the best part of myself, the part I never knew existed, until you showed it to me." Margaret stood still, holding Lucy's hands, and walked deliberately to the fireplace. Without hesitation, she fed Catherine's letter to the flames, watching her old life curl into ash and smoke, watching the promise of Boston respectability transform into nothing more substantial than a memory. "But what about respectability?" Lucy asked, her voice small and uncertain. "What about civilization? What about all the things you gave up for me?" Margaret gestured toward their home, patched and humble but warm with love, filled with the laughter of visiting students and the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work. Through the windows, she could see their garden growing green and wild vegetables and flowers mingling in joyous abandon, tended by hands that had learned to coax life from the most unlikely soil. Beyond that, the vast prairie stretched toward a horizon that no longer seemed empty but full of possibility. "This is civilization, sweetheart. This is respectability." Margaret's voice carried a conviction that surprised her with its strength. "Not what the world tells us we should want, but what we've actually built. Together. With our own hands, our own hearts, our own stubborn refusal to accept that love has to look like what other people expect." Lucy launched herself into Margaret's arms, and they held each other fiercely as the letter burned to nothing, taking with it the last traces of Margaret's old life. The governess who'd lived on the margins of other people's happiness, the abandoned bride who'd measured her worth by a man's approval, the woman who'd believed that respectability was something to be earned rather than claimed. Later, as sunset painted the sky in impossible colors, they sat on their porch watching their small corner of the world settle into evening peace. Students waved as they passed on their way home. Parents called out greetings and updates on their children's progress. Neighbors stopped to share news and gossip, and the comfortable intimacy of a community that had accepted them, not despite their unconventional family, but because of the love that made it work. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucy asked, her head resting against Margaret's shoulder. "Giving up everything for me?" Margaret smiled, pulling the child closer, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair and the deeper fragrance of belonging that surrounded them both. "Oh, my darling girl, don't you see I didn't give up everything? I found everything. I found you, yes, but more than that, I found myself. The woman I was always meant to be, but never had the courage to become." The stars emerged one by one, ancient witnesses to their quiet contentment. They had built something miraculous from the broken pieces of their separate sorrows, not just a home, but a love that transcended every boundary the world tried to impose. In choosing each other, they had chosen to redefine family itself, to prove that the strongest bonds were forged not in blood, but in the daily decision to stand together against whatever darkness the world might send their way. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, carrying some other dreamer toward an uncertain future. But Margaret and Lucy were already home. They were already family. They were already exactly where they belonged in the space between what the world expected and what love made possible. If this story of chosen family and unexpected love touched your heart, Please give it a like and subscribe for more tales that explore the beautiful complexity of human connection. Because sometimes the most profound families are the ones we build from scratch with nothing but hope and the courage to choose love over convention.